Popcorn Ramona.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Ramona Gupta. I'm at Columbia College, Chicago. And I work in Asian American Cultural Affairs, part of our Multicultural Affairs office. And we start September 8th, the day after Labor Day. Oh, Stephen, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Dederick, and I am at Ohio State. I'm a graduate student and also work in the Multicultural Center. And our academic year starts on Tuesday. I have 2 classes to attend and 1 to teach on that day. So that will be fun, and the excitement is starting again. Popcorn, I guess Peter is the only one left.
Hi everyone, my name is Peter Lim Tongvirat, and I just started as over at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and I'm their coordinator for social justice education. And the students will be coming in Monday, so move-in is this weekend. I'm going to be helping out with some welcome week stuff, but yeah, so things are starting really fast. I'm like super excited, but also kind of nervous. But yeah, so Popcorn, Virginia.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing. So we could just jump right into it, and Cleda has some great questions. Hopefully everyone had a chance to look at them. If not, I'm sure Cleda will be able to ask them as well.
Right. So my first question is, why is it important for us to understand the racial identity exploration process for students of color, particularly Asian American students?
I can attempt to start. So I think, like, as student affairs professionals or graduate students who are looking to go into student affairs and stuff, I think that it's just important to understand that context. I think is the biggest word of where students are coming from and exploring their identities, how that starts and continues. I don't think it ever really ends. And it helps just fill in those gaps of like where they're coming from, and like college especially is maybe the first time they are exploring some of those things, and so it's important for us to understand those backgrounds and how they are moving in and out of these different processes to understand their identity in this new space. And so I think that's for students of color in general, but again, I think the whole chapter, of course, is about Asian American and APIKC students, and I know we'll talk later about the point of entry model and stuff, but yeah, I think it's just a really great intro to like providing contextual background of how students are starting to explore that identity.
Right, I think that you said that many students are starting to explore their identity during college, and I think there are 4 to 5 years, maybe 6 years. Those are the most formative years of their young adult life, and many of them coming from predominantly white environments where they may have been the minority, maybe never even explored it because of the lack of interaction with others, but also if they're coming from an environment where they are the majority, where everyone looked like them, but then going to a predominantly white institution, you know, there's just different ways where they can pretty much encounter cognitive dissonance and just start realizing that their social identity, particularly racial identity, is something that is important to them.
And I also think too, like, in understanding that, like, for a lot of these students, not just in terms of racial identity, but other identities,
maybe like this may be the first time they're exploring it, so having an understanding and how it looks, especially for Asian American students in terms of race, but also understanding like how that might be nuanced or maybe intersecting with other identity development that's happening, and therefore being aware that there may be some nuances, and then having that to inform how do we support these students through, not only that particular aspect of their identity, but understanding that a lot of these identity explorations are happening at the same time. So I think it's important to at least understand the base, but also understand that there's a lot of flexibility to it because our students are not just one identity. So.
So, in the beginning of the chapter, Mamta talked about her own personal experience about how she was involved in the Indian Student Association undergrad, and that's where she really started to explore her Asian American identity. What about for you all? When did you first identify with the term Asian American?
I'll go. I don't remember exactly when, but I do remember a lot of it happening for me in college. Like, I don't know if I really thought about it much before then. I'm sure I did, because I went to a predominantly white high school in the suburbs of Chicago. But definitely in college, that's, I think it's a fairly typical narrative, right? That I took Asian American Studies classes. I got involved with some Pan-Asian American student groups, and that's when I think that's the first time, especially in the classes, that I really started to understand the the commonality of experiences, and to, the kind of experience of like an Asian American Studies class also being like 75% therapy, right? And like working through all the things that we never talked about with anybody else when we were younger, and realizing that other Asian American young people went through the same things. So definitely for me, college was a formative time in terms of building an Asian American identity.
I can go. So I think for me, it was definitely around college time too. But I started thinking more about my ethnic heritage as being Thai American first, and that was my entry point. So I went to Northwestern University for undergrad, and then I struggled a lot trying to find spaces and communities for me to belong in. And Thai Club was the first place that I really starting to feel like I belong in a place. And that's where I kind of stayed for the first 2 years of my undergrad experience. But then over that course of time, I started noticing, I started thinking about how I relate to this community, but it still feels like not the right perfect place for me. And a lot of it had to do with Thai Club being majority Thai international students. And I grew up not really knowing much about Thai culture at all. So I grew up knowing how to speak Thai, but then I lost the ability to speak it. I can understand a little bit of it. So there was that huge cultural gap between Thai Americans that were born here and then Thai international students. And so that really pushed me to think about where else do I find community, not just within the community that identifies as Thai. And I think that was around the time where I was lucky to have a lot of mentors who were Asian American Studies minors. And they started talking to me about the things that they were learning about, and kind of trying to get me to think about my identity more critically. And I think that was when I started. I took a huge leap of faith in taking Asian American Studies classes because at one point I was a bio and physics double major. So that's when I realized that, for the first time in my life, I'm reading something that really resonates with my experiences here, being Asian American, and I started really thinking about what is my racial identity, not just my ethnic heritage. So, yeah.
I feel as if my development and learning took place a little slower. I felt like I took ethnic studies classes in college, but I wasn't developmentally ready to really kind of grasp what that all means to me. So I think it was after at NASPA, learning about APIKC, kind of really honing in on looking at managers and business CEOs and how a lot of people are white males. That is when I felt like I kind of understood what it means to be Asian American, as well as moving to outside of California. And I had mentioned this in a different chat that being in California, I felt as if my identity was very supported. I saw a lot of Asian Americans around. So I didn't think too much about it, but leaving California was when I noticed it more. Being one of the only in a room was much more noticeable, and that's when I felt strongly in my identity as Asian American.
I would say kind of similar to Virginia. I going to college, so I grew up in Southern California also, and so I was not in a majority white space until I went to college. But even there, and I've talked about this on previous discussions, I think, of college was a time for me to really explore my biracial identity, and that was a lot more salient for me. And so I think also similar to Virginia, it was really going into the profession and during grad school, finding APIKC as a professional home within NASPA is when I felt more community with the API community, because in college people saw me as the multiracial person. That was my thing. That was what I fought for and did programming around. And although my Asian part of my identity was very important to that, that wasn't the most salient thing. But I think it's become a lot more now that I see the importance of the visibility of the API community, especially in higher education, and being the only one in a lot of institutions. So I think I've just started to identify a lot more with that experience and that side of myself.
I think for me, in college, even though I was a founding mother for Asian American Awareness Sorority, but I was still very much associating with my ethnic identities because I'm multi-ethnic, and a lot of my sorority sisters identified as Vietnamese Americans. So there was always this, talk about how our ethnic identities were important. And I grew up in Texas, so I think it was actually grad school when I moved to Michigan, to the Midwest, where I saw, there was an opportunity to interact with other Asian American professionals or graduate students for the first time in my life, and seeing that they actually had something called Asian American Studies or, ethnic studies. We didn't have that in my undergraduate institution. I didn't even know that existed until I went to graduate school, and so that really opened up my eyes and allowed me to really explore what it meant to be Asian American and really identify with the term, because I had already developed my identity as a multi-ethnic person at home, but also in my undergraduate career. Um, so Mamta talks about polyculturalism, and she says that um, it challenges us to examine how the intersections of our identities perpetuate oppression of certain groups and the dominance of other groups. In what ways has this challenged us?
So for me, the first thing I thought of actually, like, I think, of course, it's talking about dominance of the white race and oppression of other races and ethnicities, but I was thinking about it in terms of a lot of the movement around Black Lives Matter and what that has meant for the API community and the sometimes distancing that can happen, and that there is this experience as a person of color, as an API person, but also I think it's a very different experience, and that we need to be an ally to that other oppressed identity in a lot of ways, and be a community of people of color, but also support people who identify as Black throughout this Black Lives Matter campaign. And I don't think that has been happening as much as it should. Yeah, you've got your sign. I like that. Yeah, and so I think that there's been a lot of great articles about that, about what it means to stand up or not to stand up as an API person for the Black Lives Matter campaign and movement and everything that is happening with that. And so that was what I first thought of when reading that, was like, how are we looking at that just within communities of color as well?
Um, so I think of this a lot in terms of like student works, in the sense that, so kind of going back to the previous question, but it relates to this one. So I feel like my identity as Asian American or API, I didn't really begin to explore that until it became more salient, but it became more salient for me during my coming out process, and that's when I was trying to navigate within LGBT organizations, which at my undergrad institution, University of Maryland, a lot of the people who consistently showed up in those spaces identified as white. And so their stories around navigating some of those challenges, while similar, had very distinct differences as well, particularly in terms of certain cultural norms and what that meant to come out within a very staunch, traditional Taiwanese family. And so when I see this, I think a lot about like how even within student organizations, how when these intersecting identities come into play, how just because one identity happens to be, of a similar community to the other, how sometimes in student orgs there's unfortunately like a splitting off because there are certain experiences that are still not understood or not brought to the forefront from, because the leadership might represent, or the issues commonly spoken about might only represent one particular piece of one's identity. And so as a practitioner, I think a lot about the complexities around like, if we have these spaces and let's say they're particularly identified or marked as a specific space, how do we also support other identities that may be also at play but not being brought to the forefront, but still need to be discussed because the inherent presence of that identity has caused individuals to consider what the racial identity might mean. So
I can see this being a real challenge, particularly, well, I can see it being a challenge where I work, but just in general in how we approach programming. Because reading this, it even kind of threw me for a loop because, well, it threw me for a loop that somebody has actually like articulated this in a very specific way, right? That we should be approaching our work as anti-racist, right, and not about celebrating diversity. And I honestly wonder, especially for multicultural affairs kinds of settings, how many of us are actually doing that, right? Like, I think the charge from a lot of college administrations is because knowing that most college administrators are white men, so if we're working at, at predominantly white institutions, right, if they've gotten to the point of moving beyond appreciation, cultural appreciation, and so if that's all they're really expecting us to do, when I think about my job description, I feel like that is a big chunk of it is it's meant to be do programming that celebrates Asian American cultures, and I've chosen to take it beyond that, right? And I work through an anti-racist framework, and all of my programming has incorporated social justice into it, right? But as a whole, especially for people who don't work in those settings, I feel like their understanding of what we do is really just that, from that multicultural model of celebrating diversity. Like, here's some Asian stuff, here's some African American stuff, here's some Latino stuff, right? And it's, oh, here's some LGBTQ stuff. I don't know that I have a point. It just really struck me as providing clarity that I just really don't know if anyone is even if they're doing the work within their own offices, if they're pushing that narrative more broadly within their institutions and beyond their institutions to make people understand that it's more important to come from that perspective of anti-racism and polyculturalism. Does that make any sense?
It does. And I've thought about that a lot too. Like, how is multicultural affairs offices structured that allow the perpetuation of oppression? And so that was one angle that I thought of too. So you took care of that. And then so the second angle that I thought of was how we are all structured by identity, and how does that perpetuate like, I guess the like oppression, like inter-oppression within communities of color and other marginalized communities. How does that perpetuate division within our students? Because like based on like how programs are set up, are all programs coming from an intersectional approach? Even how are our physical spaces even allowing students to interact with each other, or are we kind of breaking it off per identity? And so I feel like this is something that I thought about a lot, because when I went to, from my experience as a student, as an undergraduate student, we had two different houses, two different buildings. One, it was the Black House, and it's named the Black House for a lot of historic reasons, honoring student activism. But that was separated from the Multicultural Center, which housed all the other different, racial identity-based multicultural affairs offices. And so I remember as a student, I never went into the Black House until I started becoming more active on campus. And that was just a way that, just by the pure physical space of and the construction of the office, like, created a lot of that division. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like, how do we move forward with our offices, not just like our physical offices, our programs, how are our programs structured, and our responsibilities structured, so that we don't keep on perpetuating a multiculturalism approach, but take in a more intersectional polycultural approach.
I think space is very important. At my former institution, the U of I, they had the Black House, received as the African American Cultural Center, the La Casa Cultural, and those houses were created in the 1970s, right? And it was because of student activism. And you know, they eventually created a Women's Resources Center, LGBT Resource Center, as well as a Native American House. But the Asian American Cultural Center didn't exist until 2005. Huge gap, you know? And when I was thinking about that history, what did the Asian American students do between 1970s, even before that, but also particularly 1970s to 2005? You know, where did they go for resources? And here at the UW, they have a multicultural student center, and so you have different, you know, specialists, social justice specialists, somebody working with all the multicultural organizations. So they cover a lot of different topics. And one of the questions that I had posed was, you know, when it comes to topics of diversity and inclusion on many campuses, you know, it's very much a black and white binary, right? And so Asian Americans are often, more often than not, excluded or not included in the conversation. So when we're thinking about space, conversations, you know, just thinking about our students and the environment that they're in, how have we addressed it on our campuses?
I just wanted to say that U of I was my alma mater, University of Illinois, and so I was one of those students who was there in that in-between period, right? So when I went to school, it was right after the Asian American Studies program. It wasn't really a program yet, but that's when the classes were like starting to be offered, right? I benefited from the folks who came right before me. They were the ones that did all the fighting. And so I just wanted to say that in response to that, where we gathered was in the student organizations and in those classes, right? And that was it. And it's amazing that they have the center now, and they have David and Maylin and all these wonderful folks there. And as a separate aside, now they're experiencing all new kinds of pressures because U of I has the largest Chinese student population, right, of international Chinese students. And so they're being charged with also providing services to them. And that never used to be their focus, right? It's an Asian American Cultural Center. And so that's a whole other issue that affects the work that we do. Just wanted to throw that in.
I think I'd say I'm fortunate to be in a space where that intercultural piece is thought about by the staff, at least, but I don't think that always gets translated to the students, and that the work we're doing in the students' mind, you know, and it's, you know, very much has to do with where they are and exploring their identities and understanding these issues in a broader context. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, because I was there once too, of just thinking about our own siloed identities. But you know, I think trying to create those spaces where two groups are hosting an event together because the issue affects both their communities is something that at least staff and the other graduate students were trying to do. But that's hard to get across to the students who really care about and are proud of their identities, and they see that as the primary focus of their club or their event. And so, yeah, I think it's just trying to have those conversations of what does this mean in a broader picture.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, so I think a lot about, in particular, the context I work in a multicultural center, right, that we work in a siloed model by identity. And that's kind of an old model, right? And there are a lot of universities now that are doing models that are based more on functional areas. And this makes me think, and I think a lot about how I wish that I was in that kind of a model, because I've seen sort of the ways that this siloed model hurts us. But then I think about how if we were to move to that non-siloed model, do we lose, right? Do we end up falling back into the conversations that relate only to this black-white binary? And do we lose the perspective of, in particular on my campus, we have a very small Asian American student population. But I know that's one of the questions that Cleda wanted to talk about, and that's something that happens very commonly. We're left out of the conversation. So I'm not sure, what is the right way to do it, but I also know that when I'm able to do programming that is not focused just on Asian American populations, when it's broader conversations related to social justice, that's where we're approaching for more of that polycultural and intersectional model that seems to, but I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think it's also an advantage for us to be all in one space because it's easier to build those collaborations. So even that, right, the simple idea of just having two groups, work together on a particular program or event because it's an issue that affects both of their communities, it's a little bit easier to facilitate that when you exist in a space together. And when you don't, when you're in these different houses, I don't know if that becomes more difficult.
So I feel like this really reminds me of, I know this sounds weird, but like graduate school and like understanding your personal foundations, like understanding yourself before you can help others. I feel like in what you all are talking about, it's similar to that. Like we're helping students understand themselves first, like so that's where the siloing comes into play. And then how do we get them to see the larger picture, right? And it's building those bridges, but then how do we know when students are ready? At what point is it appropriate to build those bridges for them, to help them build those bridges? I don't know.
I also think, like, with that, I'm thinking a lot about, too, like one of the advantages to siloing, even though I'm not a particular fan of that model at all, is the fact that sometimes it's easy for students to identify who they need to speak to if they need support. And so, like, I'm thinking, and I think it's because I literally just left my undergraduate institution. I'm thinking a lot about me as a freshman, and, like, if it was, like, an office that was just simply, like, the intercultural center, and there wasn't specific coordinators or specific places I could go, like, I don't know if I even would have ever walked through the door to begin with, because that thought would have been incredibly intimidating for me to go up to somebody and then, like, them being like, actually, you need to talk to someone else, and I just, like, put myself out there. And so, like, I also think about it from that point of view, like in terms of development, are there advantages for siloing so that students can explore particular parts of their identity because that's what's most salient to them? And most students as freshmen aren't thinking from a very intersectional perspective. They're probably living in a very intersectional way, but they're just, that's not how they're understanding themselves yet. So I'm with you, Ramona. Like, I don't really know what the better answer is. Like, I know my critiques of the system, but then I also wonder, like, to what extent, like, what students would potentially never even walk through the door if it's not, like, specifically pre-ordered for them.
So it's important for students to really be self-aware, right? And so Mamta goes into this model that she created, the point of entry model of Asian American identity consciousness. And so she talks about all these multiple points of entry. Basically, there are different factors. When you're thinking about the different points of entry, there's, familial influence, external influence, perceptions, immigration history, self as other, ethnic attachment, which a lot of us may have identified with, and then other social identities in the intersection of those identities. When you're working with Asian American students, which factors do you see more prevalent that allows them to enter this model of consciousness of their Asian American identity.
For me, just with the students that I happen to work with, I think for a lot of them, it's ethnic attachment and familial influence. And I think because they don't necessarily know about some of the other stuff, they're not, you know, once we have those conversations and they're able to articulate what they already understand or what they've already experienced, then the other things I think come into play. But I think those are the things that I've witnessed the most as being the most salient in the very beginning. Or like the first times that I'm able to get them to open up in group conversations around identity is when we start with the lived experiences they've had through their families, which I think makes sense.
Something that I've seen recently with Asian American students is the external influence and perceptions. Many of them are increasingly, I guess, experiencing microaggressions inside and outside of the classroom due to a large exponential growth of international students. And so this is what I've seen in the last 2 to 3 years. You know, many of them are saying, you know, their academic experiences in the classroom, their peers don't realize that they're even Asian American, or their peers assume things, and but also like just outside of the classroom, right? Whether it's in their residence hall or if they're walking across campus, right? People have said things or done things that made them feel as though it goes into another factor, as if, you know, that perpetual foreigner stereotype, right? So self as other, and so I think that a lot of them are identifying, you know, with these factors, and eventually, you know, coming into that identity consciousness.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm also wondering how much the narrative of Asian American students identifying more with white cultures is still a dominant thing. I'm really curious to hear about, like, on your campuses or the students you've worked with, if that still holds true. I feel like I still hear that is like the case, but I'm not sure if I really if that is the truth. I feel like there's at least, I experience with my students that they don't necessarily know a lot about Asian American history. They're not, you know, the political identity to them, they're not really, you know, aware of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that their experiences are defined by white experiences, as much as I feel like it was when I was in college. But I don't know. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
I see that with students that come from suburbs versus from the city.
Sure.
Right? Definitely Chicago. I'm starting to see it here in Wisconsin. You know, they're coming from all over different rural parts of Wisconsin, and some are actually from Madison. But I think that it's just the availability of resources, or just seeing people that look like them. It makes a huge difference in one's experience and perception of your identity. But again, I think that it's up to them in college to seek out those resources. But I wish as practitioners we were more proactive, and, you know, and we are. We host multicultural student organization fairs, or we're definitely at different fairs and representing. But, you know, we don't want to, like, scare them away, right? We want to help them come into their own identity at their own time, but we want them to be aware. So it's hard.
From my experiences, I would say that's still very common. And I would remember a lot of students having like an aversion to Asian American organizations and not wanting to be a part and trying to kind of be a part of the more mainstream white organizations. Um, and so I remember my junior year, that's when we had a we tried to build a storytelling movement on campus to share our experiences being Asian American, and the themes that really came out from that movement was people struggling with being shameful of being Asian American, because being Asian American is being the other. And so I feel like that's still prevalent in the spaces I've been in. And so I'm really curious to see how it may be the same or may be different here in Indiana, because this is the first time I'm moving out of Chicago. But I'm also just wondering, like, what is it like regionally? Like, how Asian Americans kind of develop and see themselves about this. So I don't know, because like I only know things from a Midwest perspective.
I don't know if I can really speak to the regional thing, but like one thing I was thinking about while you all were talking was also the potential shaming that happens for people who aren't joining these groups, by the people who feel very strongly about their identity and who assume like, oh yeah, like that Korean person's going to want to join the Korean club, right? Because they are Korean and they must have the same experience as me and they must want to share that with the world and put on these programs and be around other Koreans, for example. And I have seen students kind of make those assumptions about, okay, like I'm going to get that person to join and they're going to want to, but when they don't, or if they join, whatever the predominantly white groups are, the programming board, student government, sorority and fraternity life, there is that shaming factor of like, oh, like you're kind of a sellout, like you're forgetting about your identity. But that's not necessarily the case. That's, there are some people who do want to distance themselves, but there are also people who want to explore whatever, or who didn't necessarily grow up in a setting where they've thought about their racial or ethnic identity before and still aren't. So, yeah, that's just something I was thinking about with that.
Right. I recently had a conversation with a student. I advised her in a student organization for Asian American students, and she helped out with different programming and marketing aspects, but she didn't really explore her identity as much, I would say. She was very into research, and now she's a graduate student about to start her PhD in some sort of ecological engineering. But she shared with me that it wasn't until during her master's program in engineering when she started interacting with other Chinese or Taiwanese identified students, international students, when they called her out saying, "Oh, you're not Chinese enough for us." And she says, "Well, but I am. I'm Chinese American. How am I not Chinese enough?" She was trying to figure out who she was, and that's when she realized, okay, I need to start exploring my Asian American identity and what that means in different spaces. And so it's very interesting to see, the timeline of, how students progress in their identity exploration and what points of their life make a great impact. Okay, before I leave, I'll just pose that last question. So the last question is, thinking about all of our students that we support, what are some ways in which we as practitioners can help our students, particularly Asian American students and the allies, explore their identity? Bye, y'all.
Oh, She literally left. Oh. I thought she was like saying like a preemptive goodbye before the last question. I'm actually I don't know. It's tough. So I'm working in the student affairs side, and I mean in a multicultural affairs center, and we don't have an Asian American Studies program. So I'm constantly wrestling with how much I want to fill that gap, because even though I have some students now who are finally ready to try to fight for some kind of Asian American Studies program, in reality, it's going to be a huge, huge uphill battle at our school, just because of the number of students that we have that are Asian American, and because we're constantly in a budget crisis because our budget is completely tuition driven. And so our enrollment is going down. So, I mean, it's just not terribly realistic to expect that to happen anytime soon. But I always feel this nagging obligation to try to fill that gap, and I'm trying to be even more conscientious about it now. And so I'm one of the Facebook groups for folks who are doing work like this. A few of us were talking about having a similar, like a Google Hangout or something, to start talking about our curriculum and really shaping that up in a way that best serves our students. And I don't know that with my Asian American students I've ever really approached it in that way because of just the nature of my job. It was split between doing Asian American cultural affairs and doing other work. And so that's one way, but I honestly don't know if that's going to work for our students. Like, I don't know if they're going to come. I don't know. I know that when I do things sporadically with them that really go deep into identity exploration, they like it. But then I have other students that say, oh, well, I don't always want to do social justice stuff. And they kind of lump that stuff together, I think. So I don't know. But I'm hoping that by being more structured in the way that I deliver that kind of programming, that it will help fill some of those gaps. Because what I really don't want to see is students leaving the college after 4 years, 5 years, and not having done some of that identity development. And where I feel like I got that through Asian American Studies, they don't have that opportunity. And they hear me talk about that all the time. But it's tough, because it's like that's not really what I'm supposed to be doing, I feel like. I don't know. I struggle with that constantly. I will add one more thing, which is just that I definitely still think that it's important to always approach it, or as much as possible, right, through an intersectional lens. Whatever that means, whatever you're actually incorporating into it, that is always there.
I would say too, like, so, like, as a graduate student, and particularly as a GA, there are times where I feel like I'm very bound in what I can do, because, like, I report to somebody, and at the current moment, like, I've just finished my first year, so they're just beginning to loosen the reins a little bit and give me a little bit more autonomy, but I think a lot about where those opportunities are. So I'll say, like, in my experience so far in my institution, we don't typically look to have those developmental conversations, not with API students, not with a lot of our students overall. And so I think a lot about how do I, again, kind of chip away at that culture, and talk about, like I think a lot of it is, and I think it's a product of the particular program that I'm in, I think a lot about doing, like, the work and kind of opening that up by asking students to just share their story, and then kind of help them bridge some of those pieces, because I found, like what you said, Amanda, like, if I go directly and say, like, let's, like, and I identify it as, like, we're talking about identity or, like, anything like that, students either back away or they shut down, or they might be like, oh, that was good, but then they're very drained, so there's a lot of pushback. So, but I think for me, I'm kind of like playing around with that idea, like what are ways to get students to begin to think about it, or like for a seed to be planted, but accepting the fact that it may not be me, that gets to actually like see that seed grow into something. Like maybe my role at the moment is to just plant the seed, and then, you know, slowly, as a result of other experiences they have, maybe that seed will turn into something. So.
So the whole planting the seed thing really resonates with me. Um, and I feel like that's what I'm going to have to, like, that's what I'm going to be doing a lot in my new role because, so just a little bit about IUPUI. It's uh, it's a urban institution, 30,000, only 3% Asian, and I don't know how much of that 3% is Asian American versus international Asian students, because I know that we have a fairly large like a decently large international population. So like that's a really tough question for me because I feel like here the Asian American students don't really have much. Like I think I'm like one of two people in the entire division that are Asian American. And so this is like a very new role for me, but then I kind of see this as like a very powerful thing too, so that now there's like more than one Asian American student affairs professional that they can actually visibly see me. And I think that can be very powerful for students to start thinking about identity, the fact that I am here, that I can have conversations with them, and that they don't have to feel uncomfortable talking about like whatever their experiences are, because I'm like I mean, me being Asian American, I understand. So I think that's one big thing of just like being there and showing that like there is some support so that I can help plant seeds. One other just personal reflection that I'll just share is that this is a question that I'm going to be wrestling with a lot because I feel like I'm going to be the expert to go to as one of two Asian Americans. And I'm also working I'm not working in a multicultural affairs office. I'm in student involvement, so it's a white space. And this is the first time that I'm going to be really in like a white space because like a lot of my experiences have been in multicultural affairs or Asian American nonprofit. And so I feel like it's just going to be a lot of picking my battles with being the only one and trying to educate, but finding that balance of like, how do I call out someone on something because if they said something racist, or like as like a new coordinator, I don't know, I'm gonna have to really learn that balance and how to navigate things. But I feel like that's like right now what I can do as I try to adjust to being here, because I don't really know the political system yet.
And Peter, I would say to that, that's like, I mean, Virginia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of this too is also like us sharing our experiences. Like, yes, we're talking about this book, but we're also here to learn from each other because a lot of us have those similar experience of it being our first time, of being the only in a space, or navigating the politics of when to speak up and when not to speak up. And so definitely like reach out to any of us like about that, because this is like support group too. So yeah, definitely with that. And to Cleda's question too, I think like to bring it back to the whole point of entry thing, like that's kind of when we look at all those spokes, that's a way to just even start the conversation with students, is like whatever resonates most with them, like you were saying, asking them about what their story is and where they come from. You can start that work and start that conversation by figuring out what resonates most with them and which spoke they're entering or exiting or whatever. and that's a good place to start with an organization or with a group or just an individual. And so, yeah.
I would also say, like, use that new person thing to your advantage, right? Just be like, oh, I don't know the culture. Just say what you want. Well, I want to thank everyone for their time. We're closing in on our 1 hour discussion, and I really appreciate everyone showing up, and it's been a very great chat.
Thank you all for sharing. I always really appreciate the time together. I really appreciate it.
Does anyone have any final comments or anything?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Does anyone have any final comments?
We forgot to take the group picture while Cleda was here.
Oh no.
Taking pictures of us while we've been talking without us knowing, so.
We can take another one and then Photoshop her in, I guess.
Yeah.
Whatever you need to do, Virginia.
Do you want to take a picture? We can do a thumbs up or something. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great one.
Wait, Virginia, send me the screenshot. Like, I kind of want to Photoshop Cleda in. I want to be tasked with that. Okay.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. It was so good to see you.
See you next month.